Hi everybody and welcome to Murder at Bedtime. This is a 10 to 20 minute true crime bedtime story. No frills, no waffle, ad free, no sponsors. I don't even want you to buy me a coffee. It's just me and you, uninterrupted, until the end of the story. If there is any waffle, it's at the end where you can just switch me off or listen on to me spouting my gobbledygook. And with that, let's crack on. Today, I would like to tell you the story of Margaret Allen, known to her family as Maggie, but who later in life liked to be known as Bill, and lived and thought of herself as a man. I'm going to refer to Margaret as Bill as soon as we get past her childhood, and then for the rest of the story. If I make any mistakes in this story on transgender subjects, please accept my apologies and put it down to my naivety on the subject. This case, even if Bill did commit the horrible murder for which he was condemned, which seems almost certain, still doesn't sit very well with me, and I find myself, rightly or wrongly, feeling more than a tad sympathetic to him. Of course, there is no excuse for taking someone's life in this way, so please don't think I defend his actions in any way. If you disagree, please let me know on Instagram or Facebook, or if you are watching this on YouTube, down below in the comments. And so I wanted to find out as much as I possibly could on this case. And with that, let's get on with the story. Margaret Allen was born on Plantation Street, Rawtenstall, Lancashire, in 1906. She was the 20th child out of 22, her mother having 16 children with her first husband and 6 with her second. Now, it's very hard to find anything about Margaret's childhood, but she was known to be a bit of a tomboy in her younger years. Reaching her 20s, she had taken to dressing like a man, drinking and smoking both in that day and age, mostly carried out by men, along with swearing and cussing. She preferred the company of men and would often be seen mixing with them in the local pubs and working men's clubs. Now, still not much is known about Margaret until she moved from Bolton to a place called Backup, also in Lancashire, with her mother. She was the only one of the children still at home and apparently didn't really mix with her siblings apart from 2 of her sisters. She also didn't really have any close friends. In 1935, Margaret told people he knew that he had been into hospital for a procedure that had made him into a man. Now, this is very, very doubtful, as the first successful operation of this sort was not completed until 1951, when Roberta Cowell was able to undergo surgery, but even then it was done largely in secret, or so I have been led to believe in my research. But anyway, from that day forward, Margaret became Bill, and he continued to live and work as a man, preferring heavy labouring jobs, until during the Second World War, Bill got a job as a clippy, a bus conductor, for Rawtenstall Corporation Motors. This was after he had worked heaving coal as a painter and decorator and worked for the post office, but it now seemed Bill had found his niche on the buses. But unfortunately, in 1943, Bill's mum died, and it hit him really hard, and he spiralled into a deep depression. He invested his savings in a house on Backup Road in Rawtenstall that had once been the town's old police station. Now, I believe he didn't buy this house, but rented it, as further in my research I heard about a landlord who used to come and collect the 6 shillings and 4pence rent. From 1942 to 1946, Bill worked on the buses and was known for his good timekeeping and was popular with the townsfolk. but the company had to let him go when his personality changed and he took to verbally abusing passengers and cuffing them. Now, cuffing is usually a backhanded slap across the back of the head or neck, if they didn't take their seats fast enough. Presumably, Bill's depression intensified after his dismissal because he became unkempt, unwashed, and smoked and drank in excess. He did have a job at the local slipper factory just before his arrest, but even though he was reported to be a hard worker, he was let go for a non-specified reason. It was about this time that he met a pretty 30-year-old divorcee called Annie Cook, and they struck up an unlikely friendship. Annie could see how down and depressed Bill was, and had witnessed him trying to commit suicide by putting a gas pipe in his mouth. And she said he had attempted suicide a number of times. They decided to take a little holiday to the coastal town of Blackpool at a boarding house, where they booked in as Mr. and Mrs. Allen. It was during this holiday that Bill broached the subject of the pair maybe having sex together, which outraged Annie and affected their relationship for a time. Now, it was during this time that Bill somehow became friendly with a very eccentric neighbour called Nancy Ellen Chadwick, known as Old Nancy locally. She was 68 years old, and these days 68 is barely middle-aged, but in them days it was old. Anyway, it was quite a strange friendship, as Nancy was not very liked in the town, being a bit mean-spirited and was a bit of a scrounger. She walked the streets dressed shabbily, sitting on benches and bush shelters, begging for money for a cup of tea, even though she owned 4 properties in the town that had been left to her 17 years before by a stonemason that she used to clean for, and she made a tidy sum out of the rent she charged from them, and would often be seen counting her money in the parks of Rawtenstall. Now, Nancy and Bill apparently met at the home of a mutual acquaintance, where she mentioned that she needed sugar, which, even though the war had been over for 3 years, was still rationed. Bill told her he could get hold of some, and that's how they started talking. After that, Bill would drop in on Nancy quite regularly, but unfortunately never with any sugar. On Saturday the 26th of August, Bill called on Nancy to tell her he still didn't have the sugar, but he would have it on Monday. On the Monday morning, Nancy got up early and was at Bill's door by 9 a.m. He was probably embarrassed by the state of his home and refused her entry and actually closed the door in her face. Nancy was not seen alive again by anyone after that meeting. At 3:55 the next morning, a bus driver called Herbert Beaumont discovered Nancy's dead body sprawled on the pavement directly outside 137 Backup Road, Bill Allen's house. She was laying face down with her coat collar pulled over her battered head. The police arrived and summoned a local doctor, who, after examining Nancy, stated that she had been dead for around 10 hours and had been beaten to death most likely with the pointed end of a coal hammer, as there was ash in the wounds. The blood trail led straight to the front door of Bill Allen, and right from the very start, after interviewing him at 8 a.m. that morning, Bill was their prime suspect. A call was made to Scotland Yard, and while they made their way up north, Lancashire police carried on the search for evidence. All the time, very suspiciously being followed with keen interest by Bill, who watched them intently and frequently asked questions, and at one point rushed over to them to tell them that he had spotted a bag floating in the River Irwell behind his house. And guess what? It turned out to be Nancy's. It only contained cotton and thread, and no sign of the big wads of banknotes that she was said to have carried with her. If anyone thought that Bill was acting strangely then, later on at his local pub, the Ashworth Arms, Bill was excitedly telling anyone who would listen that he was the last person to see Nancy alive, and how she was a fool for counting all her money in public, and how she had a secret pocket sewn into her underskirt. This, of course, didn't go unnoticed by the police, who duly called in on Bill early the next morning. In a search of his house, blood was found on an inside wall close to the doorway. More blood was found in the coal cellar. Some of Nancy's hairs were found on his clothing, and a number of her personal items were found in his house. When formally charged with her murder, Bill straightaway confessed, stating, quote, "I was in a funny mood, and she seemed to insist on coming in. I just happened to look around and saw a hammer in the kitchen, and on the spur of the moment, I hit her with it. She gave me a bit of a shout, and that seemed to set me off more, and I hit her a few times more. I don't know how many." And that was his only explanation ever to why he murdered Nancy. But after killing her, he then moved her into the coal cellar. He then went out to do some food shopping with Annie Cook, and then they went for a drink at the Ashworth Arms. In the afternoon, he visited one of his sisters, and then back to the Ashworth Arms, going home and to bed around 9:15 p.m. Sometime after midnight, he decided to get up and to drag Nancy's body onto the street directly outside his house. The trial of Margaret Allen, who wasn't lawfully known as Bill, took place at Manchester Assizes on the 8th of December 1948 and only took 5 hours. Bill, dressed in a fawn overcoat, dark blue trousers, a check shirt and a brightly striped tie for the occasion, an action that his defence barrister had pleaded with him not to do, as it would do him no favours with the jury. His defence was insanity. The prosecution said robbery was the motive. Bill was in a lot of debt, well behind with his rent, and he was just about to have his gas and electricity cut off. He also may have had loans from Nancy Chadwick that he hadn't been paying back. He didn't give evidence in his defence, and his forthright cold statement of guilt to the police, with not one word of remorse or regret, worked solidly against him. Now, was he trying to show the world this is how a real man acts, or was he, after so many suicide attempts, happy that someone would now be doing it for him? Who knows? But the jury took just 15 minutes to find him guilty. Judge Justice Sellers sentenced him to hang, and his execution was set for January the 12th. Annie Cook was the only person who visited Bill and valiantly tried to get signatures for a petition to have the sentence commuted, but only managed to collect 162 signatures. The Home Secretary denied any reprieve. On Bill's last meeting with Annie Cook, he told her not to attend the hanging, but to go to the street corner where they normally met at 9 a.m. on the hour of the execution. On the morning of the execution, irritable to the end, Bill kicked over his last breakfast, saying, "I don't want it, and no one else is going to enjoy it." Now, probably the worst thing for Bill, though, was he was made to wear a prison dress for his execution. Witnesses said he went to his death with head held high, braver than most men. At 9 a.m. sharp, he was hanged by Albert Pierpoint. The only real mourner he had was Annie Cook, who was seen crying at the corner where Bill had asked her to wait. Well, I know there is no excuse for taking a life, but I can't help feeling a bit sorry for Bill. I believe he really suffered mentally with his sexuality and couldn't cope with it and the loss of his mum. And his rejection by Annie and losing his precious job that he really enjoyed, I think made him suicidal. In this day and age, he would have been accepted and helped. Even if found guilty, he probably would have received a much more lenient sentence. But for all that, our main sympathy must be for Nancy, who certainly didn't deserve to die. Now, I'd like to thank Lancs Live, Murderpedia, the Lancashire Times, the Backup Times, Executed Today, and more. And a big help was The Tragic and Transgendered World of Margaret Allen by Molly Cutpurse. A very good book that gave me a lot of insight into this case. And as always, thank you to Jonathan Seagev for kindly letting me use his cursed lullaby for my intro on the podcast. Now, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave it a review. And if you're watching it on YouTube, please could you give it a thumbs up, because apparently that really helps, and maybe subscribe and ding the little bell, and you'll get notification of other episodes. You know, I think you are all awesome, and I really do thank you for listening. So I'll hopefully see you next time.